much faster, and my punches is much shorter than they've been for the last two fights.
I'm concerned only about myself, what to look for from Joe Frazier.
You're smiling as your cut goes down.
Joe Frazier once said something that shocked the boxing world. He admitted he feared certain fighters, not just respected them, feared them. The man who walked through fire, who never backed down, who became a champion by sheer will, looked into the camera and named 5 boxers who made his heart race before the bell even rang. But here's the truth about Smokin Joe. His fear didn't make him weak, it made him honest, and that honesty reveals more about his courage than any knockout ever could. Because Joe Frazier didn't run from the men who scared him. He ran straight at them. And the reasons why these 5 fighters terrified him tell us everything about what it really means to be a champion. Let's start with the name everyone knows, Muhammad Ali, the man who haunted Frazier's dreams long before they ever stepped into the ring together. Ali wasn't just a fighter to Joe. He was a psychological weapon aimed directly at Frazier's soul. Joe once said that Ali was the fastest and the trickiest, that he made you think every single second. But the fear Ali created went deeper than footwork and speed. It went into places most fighters never have to face. Ali turned boxing into warfare. He called Joe a gorilla. He called him an Uncle Tom. He told the world that Frazier was ignorant, that he wasn't a real champion, that he was just a stand-in until the real king came back. And the worst part? People believed him. Joe had supported Ali when Ali lost everything. He loaned him money. He spoke up for him. And Ali repaid that kindness by trying to erase Joe from history. That's the fear Ali created. Not just the fear of losing a fight, but the fear of being forgotten. The fear that no matter how hard you worked, no matter how much you sacrificed, someone could take your story and rewrite it. Make you the villain. Make you disappear. Their first fight in 1971 became known as the fight of the century. And Joe carried the weight of the world into that ring. He wasn't just fighting Ali. He was fighting to prove he existed. Every punch Ali threw came with a question. Are you real? Are you worthy? Do you deserve to stand here? Joe answered those questions with his fists. He walked through a storm of punches that would have broken most men. His face swelled. His body ached. But he kept coming forward. And in the 15th round, Joe threw the most famous left hook in boxing history. He knocked Ali down. He proved he was real. But the effort it took nearly destroyed him. He ended up in the hospital after that fight. His body pushed beyond what should be humanly possible. And that was just the beginning. The victory should have been enough. It should have silenced the doubters and secured his place in history. But it didn't. Because Ali never stopped talking. He never stopped rewriting the narrative. And Joe never stopped fighting to reclaim his story. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. If you had to fight someone who tried to erase your identity, who turned the world against you, how would you respond? Would you walk toward them or walk away? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story about one of boxing's bravest champions, hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started. The fear Ali created reached its peak in Manila. October 1975, the Thrilla in Manila. Most people remember it as the greatest heavyweight fight ever, but Joe remembered it differently. He said it was the closest to death he had ever been. Think about that for a second. A man who made his living getting punched in the face, who fought the most dangerous men on the planet, said one fight brought him closer to death than anything else. The temperature inside the arena was over 120 degrees. The air felt like soup, and these two warriors went to war for 14 rounds. By the end, Joe couldn't see. His eyes had swollen completely shut. Ali was ready to quit. His corner thought he might die if they let him continue, but both men kept fighting because neither one could accept defeat. Ali forced Joe to a place where the body shuts down, where the mind separates from reality, where survival becomes the only goal. That's the fear Ali represented. The fear of the absolute limit. The fear that you might actually die trying to prove you belong. And Joe faced that fear 3 times. 3 times he stepped into the ring with the man who wanted to destroy him. And every single time, he showed the world what real courage looks like. The trilogy between these two men wasn't just about boxing. It was about 2 different visions of what strength means. Ali believed strength was in speed and intelligence. Joe believed strength was in heart and determination. And when those philosophies collided, the results were legendary. But Ali wasn't the only one who made Joe's heart race. There was another man, a man who didn't try to outsmart Joe or outbox him, a man who simply overpowered him. George Foreman, Big George, the giant who hit like a freight train. Joe said something about Foreman that still gives people chills. He said nothing hits harder than time. Nothing, except for George Foreman. Think about what that means. Time is the one thing that defeats everyone. Time breaks down every champion, every legend, every unbeatable force. And Joe put George Foreman in the same category as time itself. That's not just respect, that's fear. The fear of something you can't stop, something you can't overcome, something that's just too powerful. Their first fight happened in Jamaica in 1973. Joe was the champion. He was the man who beat Ali. Everyone expected a war. What they got was a demolition. George didn't just beat Joe, he destroyed him. 6 knockdowns in 2 rounds. Joe tried to do what he always did. He tried to walk forward, slip punches, get inside, and work the body. But George just pushed him back with one hand, like Joe was a child. wild. Joe would try to duck under punches using the style that confused Ali, and he'd duck right into George's uppercut. That uppercut became Joe's nightmare. The one punch he couldn't avoid. The one weapon he had no answer for. Joe later admitted that George was too strong, that he had too much firepower. It wasn't about skill or heart. It was about physics. George Foreman was simply too big and too powerful for Joe's style to work. Someone once compared George's punching power to getting hit by a semi-truck going 40 miles per hour. Not a car, a truck. And Joe learned that the hard way. The fear George created was different from Ali. Ali made Joe fear erasure. George made Joe fear destruction. The fear that your best simply isn't good enough. The fear that there's a ceiling you can't break through. Joe fought George twice, and both times the result was the same. George proved that even the toughest heart in boxing couldn't overcome raw, overwhelming force. But here's what makes Joe special. He never made excuses. He never blamed the referee or the conditions or bad luck. He just said George was better, and he moved on. That's the mark of a true champion. Facing your fear, accepting the truth, and keeping your dignity intact. Joe understood that sometimes you meet someone who's just built different. Someone whose natural gifts create an impossible puzzle. And instead of making excuses, Joe simply acknowledged reality. That kind of honesty is rare in sports. Most fighters spend years explaining why they lost. Joe just tipped his hat and kept being Joe. He didn't let those defeats define him. He didn't let them break his spirit. He accepted them as part of his story and kept living with his head held high. George represented a truth Joe had to accept, that even the bravest heart can meet a force it cannot overcome. And there's no shame in that truth. Now let's talk about a fighter most people forget. Oscar Bonavena, the Argentine bull, the wild man who fought like he had nothing to lose. Joe feared Bonavena for one simple reason. The man would not stop. You could hit him with your best punch, the one that knocked out everyone else, and Bonavena would smile at you. Then he'd hit you back. Joe said Bonavena was a bull, that he'd hit him, and Bonavena would come back stronger. And he wasn't exaggerating. In their first fight in 1966, Bonavena did something Ali never did. He dropped Joe twice in the same round. And here's the terrifying part. One more knockdown, and Joe would have lost automatically. New York had a 3-knockdown rule back then. 3 knockdowns in one round, and the fight was over. Joe was one punch away from disaster. One more shot and his whole career could have ended before it really started. Bonavena created a specific kind of fear. The fear of the grind. The fear that you're going to have to work harder than you've ever worked, hurt more than you've ever hurt, and still not be sure you'll win. Joe had to dig deeper against Bonavena than against almost anyone. He had to find reserves of energy and willpower he didn't know existed. And even after he survived those knockdowns, even after he won the fight, he knew he'd have to do it all over again. Because Bonavena didn't respect anyone. He called Joe out after fighting Ali. He mocked him. He told the world that if he had fought Joe instead of Ali, Joe's jaw would be wired shut. That kind of disrespect fueled the rivalry. And when they fought again in 1968, it was another brutal grind. Joe won, but Bonavena's face was destroyed, gruesomely bruised, and even then, the bull was still standing. That's what Joe feared. A man who refused to quit. A man who would take everything you had and ask for more. Bonavena represented the nightmare scenario for any pressure fighter. What happens when you meet someone who absorbs everything and keeps coming? What happens when your greatest weapon becomes useless? Joe had to answer those questions twice, and both times, the answer required more pain than most people could imagine. Then there was Jerry Quarry, the Irish warrior. The man they called too tough for his own good. Joe feared Quarry for a different reason than the others. When Joe looked at Jerry Quarry, he saw himself. Another pressure fighter. Another man who came forward no matter what. Another guy with a devastating left hook and an unbreakable will. Joe once called Quarry a hell of a fighter. Tough as they come. And their fights proved it. When they met in 1969, it became the fight of the year. Not because of knockdowns or drama, but because of pure violence. Joe had to turn Quarry's face into a bloody mask just to make the referee stop it. He opened a cut so deep that you could see the white of Quarry's eye through the torn flesh. And even then, Quarry didn't want to quit. The referee had to save him from himself. That's the fear Quarry represented. The fear of the mirror. The fear of hurting someone just like you. Joe knew that to beat Quarry, he had to become a butcher. He had to do damage that would haunt him later. Because Quarry wouldn't back down. Quarry wouldn't quit. Quarry would fight until his body gave out. And Joe had to be the one to break him. That creates a psychological burden most fighters never talk about. It's one thing to knock out a guy who talks trash. It's another thing entirely to destroy a warrior who earned your respect. Quarry fought everyone. Ali, Foreman, Norton, Shavers, all the legends, and he gave them all wars. But Joe had to fight him twice, and both times he had to do things he wished he didn't have to do. That's real fear. Not the fear of losing, but the fear of what you have to become to win. Joe saw Quarry as a reflection of his own warrior spirit, and having to systematically dismantle that spirit, knowing it could just as easily be him on the other side, created a different kind of weight, a moral weight that champions rarely discuss but always carry. And finally, there's the fighter almost everyone forgets, Eddie Makin. Machin, the veteran, the gatekeeper, the man who made a young Joe Frazier feel completely lost. Joe was only in his 13th professional fight when he faced Machin. He was still learning, still figuring out how to be a pro, and Machin had been in the ring with Sonny Liston, Floyd Patterson, and all the legends of that era. He knew tricks Joe had never seen before, and in the first round, Machin made Joe pay for his inexperience. He timed Joe perfectly and hit him so hard that Joe went flying through the ropes, not down, through the ropes, out of the ring. That's humiliation on a different level. That's the kind of moment that can destroy a young fighter's confidence forever. Joe scrambled back into the ring and beat the count, but the damage was done. Not to his body, but to his mind. He realized he was in over his head. He was fighting a man who knew things he didn't. A man who could see punches coming before Joe even thought about throwing them. A man who had survived Sonny Liston's mind games and power. The fear Machin created was the fear of the unknown. The fear that there's a whole level to this sport you haven't reached yet. The fear that you might not be ready. Joe eventually stopped Machin in the 10th round, but he never forgot that first round. He never forgot the panic of being knocked out of the ring. And he never forgot that Machin, the forgotten veteran, taught him more about boxing in one night than a year in the gym ever could. Joe later said Machin was the smartest technician he faced besides Ali. That's high praise from a champion, and it shows that fear comes in many forms. Sometimes it's a giant like Foreman, sometimes it's a motor mouth like Ali, and sometimes it's an old man who knows exactly where to put his feet to make you fall. Machin proved to Joe that experience is its own kind of power, that ring intelligence can be just as dangerous as raw strength, and that a young fighter, no matter how talented, still has lessons to learn that can only come from someone who's been there before. So here's what we learned from Joe Frazier's list. Fear isn't weakness. Fear is awareness. Joe feared Ollie because Ollie could erase him from history. He feared Foreman because Foreman could break physics and overpower anything. He feared Bonavina because Bonavina refused to stay down. He feared Quarry because Quarry forced him to become something brutal. And he feared Machin because Machin showed him how much he still had to learn. But Joe didn't let fear stop him. He didn't avoid these men. He didn't make excuses. He fought them all. And in doing so, he proved something more important than any championship belt. He proved that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that the goal is more important than the terror standing in your way. Every fighter feels fear. The difference between champions and everyone else is what they do with that feeling. Do they let it paralyze them, or do they let it sharpen their focus? Joe chose the latter every single time. Joe Frazier named 5 fighters he feared most, and then he beat 4 of them. The only one who truly defeated him was George Foreman. But even in those losses, even in those brutal knockdowns, Joe never stopped being Joe. He never quit. He never complained. He just kept moving forward. That's the legacy of Smokin Joe Frazier. Not that he was fearless, but that he fought anyway. And that's a lesson every one of us can carry outside the ring. Whether you're facing a challenge at work, a problem in your personal life, or a goal that seems impossible, the lesson is the same. Feel the fear, acknowledge it, respect it, and then do what needs to be done anyway. That's what separates people who achieve their dreams from people who just talk about them. Joe faced 5 of the most dangerous men ever to lace up gloves. He looked fear in the face and decided his legacy mattered more. So what do you think? Which of these 5 fighters would have scared you the most? Let me know in the comments. And if this story inspired you, make sure you're subscribed because there are so many more legends to talk about. Thanks for watching. And remember, champions aren't made by never feeling fear. They're made by feeling it and fighting anyway.